Hello and welcome to this video tutorial from BlenderCookie.com. My name is Jonathan Williamson, and today we're going to be looking at how to unwrap the UVs to a full organic character. Now, the character that we're going to be using today is this fairly stylized female character that I did a while back, and we're going to look at how to unwrap the full UVs for the head, the body, hands, feet, etc., and unwrap them in such that we minimize stretching and things like that in order to allow us to create well-made texture maps that will display well on the model. So the first thing that I want to do is go ahead and start out by creating my seams. And seams in UV mapping allow you to basically separate out portions of the model and literally create seams in the UVs just like you would have seams in fabric while creating a shirt or anything like that, and allows us to control how the UVs are unwrapped onto a 2D planar surface. And so what I want to do, first off, right now I do not actually have a mirror modifier on this model. It's a full one-sided model, and in order to create or make the seam process a bit more optimized and speedy, I'm going to go ahead and delete half of my model by just zooming in here, and from the top view using B and for box select, and left click and dragging across the middle to select everything left of the center line. Then I'll just hit X and delete vertices. And then I'm going to very quickly add in a mirror modifier and zip it up to the top, and we'll go ahead and apply it during edit mode. So this way I can go ahead and add all my seams on just one side of the model, have it appear on both sides, and then once I'm ready to unwrap, I can go ahead and apply my mirror modifier. Now, do be careful when unwrapping with the mirror modifier on, because you're not going to see the same results in the UV window here, the UV image editor, as you would if it were already applied. So just be aware of that when you're creating your seams. And so first off, I want to think about how I want to section off my model. Since, the human body is a very complex form, we can't just, do a front, side, and back. We've got to think a little bit more than that. And we've also got to think about a couple other things. Foremost is, what kind of texturing are we doing? Are we going to be looking for a lot of detail in the face, general detail all over, things like that? Like with most characters, chances are you're going to be looking for a lot of detail in the face and pretty good detail everywhere else. And so something that you'll see done commonly is people will create a separate UV map for the head and a separate UV map for the body, and then commonly another UV map for the clothes, etc. And so the first section that we're going to do, the first seam we're going to create, is along the neckline to separate out the head from the body. And then we're actually going to be using the separate UV textures to actually have a separate map for each the head and the body. So first, let's go ahead and add a new UV texture, and we'll just call this head. And you don't actually have to hit the plus sign. As soon as you actually hit U and unwrap, it'll automatically add one if you don't have one yet. So I want to go in and add a seam first around the base of the neck. And another thing to think of when adding your seams is, how can you hide it? Because every seam that you add, you're going to have to texture over and try and make those textures meet so that the seam is invisible. And so by placing seams where they're going to be hidden, whether that's hidden under clothes, in areas that aren't often seen, such as the underarms, the groin, things like that, you can hide a lot of those seams and give yourself a little bit of playroom when it comes to texturing. And in fact, sometimes it'll allow you to completely ignore the seams, which isn't necessarily a good practice, but if you're in a time crunch, or if it's never going to be seen, or if it's completely hidden, then there's no need to put in the extra time when you're on a deadline to try and fix those seams that'll never be seen. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a seam around the base of the neck, because commonly, unless you are having a fully nude character, or if she's wearing clothes that expose the whole neckline, things like that, often this will be hidden by a shirt. And so let's go ahead and we're going to create a seam right along here. And I can do this by using my Alt right click to select the edge loops. And I'm going to then go ahead and bring it in right along here. And you can create a seam by hitting Control E and mark seam along selected edges. And you'll notice that it now appears bright red to show that I have a seam there. And in fact, if I go and hit A to select everything and hit U and unwrap, you'll notice that in the UV window, I now have a separate UV island for the head and one for the body. And obviously with the body, you can see that there's some serious problems going on. And of course the head, in fact, right now is only a single side profile. So this is what I was talking about with the mirror modifier, is because we want this to be a single flat surface with the face pretty much intact, whereas right now we're just seeing a profile. And so don't do any, don't rely on the unwrapping while adding seams, or if you're not familiar enough with UV mapping to know where to place your seams, then I would encourage you to forego the mirror modifier and work strictly by hand so that you can see the unwrapping process as you go. But since I've unwrapped a lot of different models, I have a pretty good idea of where the seams will go, and so I don't need to test the UV mapping as I go. And so I can go and help you and give you some hints as to where to place some seams so that you don't have to worry about that either. But if you want to test it as you go and see the progress each time you add a new seam, then go ahead and apply the mirror modifier if you have one and work on both sides at once. Just know that you're going to have to select every single edge twice. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and finish off the head. So we're just going to focus on the head first as we created it here. And so in that process, I want to go and hide the entire body. And so in the UV image editor, I'm just going to hit A to deselect everything. And then while hovering my mouse over the body island, I'm going to hit L to select the entire thing, and then hit W to weld it all down to a single vertex, and then hit P to pin it. And what pinning does is it locks those faces into their exact form like they are. So even if I unwrap this again, this will never change. As you can see, if I go and hit U and unwrap from the viewport, you can see that the head has taken up the entire space, but the body is still pinned down to a single vertex. And so then I can just move that over out of the way. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch over to face mode real quick. And what's nice about face mode when you be unwrapping is that it allows you to select your mesh based on seam areas. So since I have a seam all the way around here, I can just, with my mouse over the body, hit L to select the linked, and I will select only up to that seam, at which point I can just hit H to hide it, refining my viewport so I can work with the head easier. Now the next place we want to do is we need to unwrap this entire head in a planar view. And so I'm going to go ahead and I want to put a seam down the back of the head. I'm doing it down the back of the head because this keeps the face area completely intact so I can texture it pretty naturally, and also because you're not going to see the back of the head nearly as much as the front for obvious reasons, but also because a lot of times most of the back of the head is covered by hair. And so I'll go ahead and I'm going to select this bottom vertex here, and I'll go up to the front, and right about the middle of the forehead, I'm going to select that center vertex there and hit W and select vertex path, and edge length or topological will work in this case. And this just helps me from having to either select the entire loop and then deselect all down here, or selecting them all manually. And so I can hit Control E and mark seam. And right now, if we unwrap this again, you're not going to see any difference whatsoever, again, because of our mirror modifier. And so I'm going to place just one or two more seams, and then we'll move on to the body, and then see where we are at on the UVs and apply the mirror modifier. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add one more seam in here. And what this seam is going to do is it puts in basically a dart like you would see in fashion design, fabric, etc. that allows this area to kind of split off, and it'll form a empty triangular area here, which we can actually see like so, and it helps flatten out this rounded shape of the head into a flat object without avoiding stretching. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn off the stretching that I have here by bringing up the properties panel, and we're going to bring this back here in a second. I just left this on from last time I was using it, but I will talk a little bit more about that here in a little while. Okay, so that's the basic seams for the head. And so I'm going to go ahead and do just one more and then move on to the body. And the one that I want to do is I want to separate out the ears. A lot of times you will see people separate out the ears of the head, or the ears of the mesh, because it allows you to work with them further. Since the ear is such a complex form, even in scopes of an entire body's complexity, it's very hard to get it to unwrap naturally without much stretching. And so it's good to separate that out onto its own island such that you can work with it on its own. And so I'm just going to select this loop around here. Notice I'm selecting it right at the crease of the ear and the head. so that if there's a seam there, it'll be less noticeable. And then the front, there's really not much you can do about it in terms of hiding the seam, and so we'll just have to work with that when it comes to texturing. So we'll hit Control E and mark the seam, and if we unwrap it, you'll notice that it's now separated these two out into their own islands. And for those of you that may be confused, when I refer to island, an island means a set of UVs. So this would be one island, this is one island, etc. Okay, so those are the main UV or seams on the head. Let's go ahead and hit Alt-H to unhide everything, and we're going to go ahead and do the body. So first, I'm going to add a new UV texture, and we'll name this Body. If I can type one-handed. Okay, and for this, we can go ahead and hide the head, make it easier on us. So we'll select it in face mode, and I'm also going to select the ears, and then hit H to hide it. And what we want to do now is think of how we want to separate this out. I always like to separate the hands and the feet, since that gives me a little finer control. And when I say separate, we may merge them together later, because any seam that we can avoid, we want to. But for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and add a seam right here, right at the wrist, and I'm going to add another one right down at the ankle. Just like that. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and think about how we want to split this, or how we can unwrap it to create a fully unwrapped seam or model. And so the first thing I'm going to do is write down the inside of the leg, deselecting the outside of the leg and any adjacent vertices on the feet. I'm going to add a seam right there, because this will allow this tubular form of the legs to unwrap in a single flat plane. And if we go ahead and we can add a seam all the way around the base of the leg, just like this, and we'll hit Control E to mark that seam. And if we unwrap this now, you'll see the leg here is now a very nice flat shape that we can work with. We'll go ahead and do the same thing with the arm. And we'll just choose the full loop right there, so we'll mark that one. And then I'm going to put a loop or a seam right down the center of the bottom of the arm, where again, it's not going to be seen much. And we'll go ahead and mark that. And if we unwrap it once more, you can see as soon as we... Oh, I did the wrong unwrap. Here's why. I did cube projection. If we do unwrap, there we go. You can now see that the arm is a single shape. Okay, so this is getting better and better. Now you'll notice that the torso is really weird right now, and it will continue to look weird until we do a couple of things. And namely is I want to add a seam right down the center of the back, and we need to be sure to deselect the front. Again, I'm doing it down the back, since you won't see the back of the character nearly as much as you will see the front in most cases. You know, if you're doing a still shot where you're seeing her back and not the front, then feel free to put the seam down the front. You know, you kind of have to place them based on your immediate need or the goal of the project. Okay, and so right now you can see that there's still one problem, and that is that this is getting all funky right around the shoulder here. And we can solve this by just adding one more loop or one more seam right down the shoulder like this. And now if we unwrap this, you can see that it unwraps very, very nicely. Now, unfortunately, that's kind of right in the center, but there's not a lot that we can do about this at that current time. So we're going to go ahead and leave that as is, and we will look more into it further. But at this point, I've done most of the major seams except for the hands and the feet. So let's do that now. And some of you may be thinking, well, I've seen UV unwraps where they have the entire body, legs, and arms connected. And this is true, and actually I'm going to show you how to do that. But first I want to get all of the major areas set apart so that we can see where we're going and then refine it more and more as we go. Because remember, right now I'm trying to make use of my mirror modifier to get the majority of the seams applied, such that when I need to go and refine it, I don't have to worry about doing as much manual work. Now, the way that I like to do the hands and the feet is to basically split it in half edgewise and fold it over on itself along the flat side of the hand here. And so I can do this by going in and looking at my hand here, and I can see I have this center loop right here that's pretty much a middle point. So I'll just select it, and this will take just a little while to go through and select all these. due to the various turning edge loops and such for the detail in the hands. But I can select all this. And I'm just using my Alt-Shift right-click to select all these loops. And as soon as I get them all selected here in a moment, you'll see what I mean. Okay, and now on the pinky here, I'm going to end the seam right at the edge of the pinky and not continue it. I'm going to hit Control E and mark that seam. Then I'm going to go back and do the same thing along the thumb as rest of the fingers, except for the pinky. And then I'm going to continue that all the way down the side of the hand, right like this. So if I mark that seam, and now watch what happens when I'm just going to select just this one area so we can see it full screen. And I'll hit U and unwrap. And now you can see that the hand is having a few problems because it looks like I missed a couple edges. So let's go in and look. You can see I missed an edge there, or 2 edges. Just double check, see if I missed any others. Oh, okay. So now we'll select it and hit U and unwrap. And I'm missing another edge. There we are. Missing a lot of edges. Okay, now we'll try this for a third time's the charm. If I quit doing cube projection, there we go. Okay, so now you can see that it's completely unwrapping around itself right here. And right now it's a little funky just because we've got some overlap here, but we'll be able to solve that a little bit down the road. So for the time being, we're going to leave this as is. Since we've got that in place now, we'll move on to the feet. And we're going to do the same thing with the feet. And so I want to choose this center loop that I have going through here. And in this case, it goes all the way around, so it's very convenient. And I just want to deselect all of the vertices on the left, or her left side of the foot. So I'll hit Control E, mark that seam, and unwrap that. And you can see the foot actually unwrapped really nicely like that. But I need to do a little bit more because right now this is all the ankle area is getting a little messed up. And so I can solve this by, we'll just bring these edges in, Control E, mark that seam. And the reason I'm doing this one is it's right at this seam here. I could do it there, but then I would have 3 different corners with which to try and fix the seams, whereas here I will only have this one edge. So we'll do that again. And there you can see it now unwraps very, very nicely. Okay, at this point, I'm going to unhide everything, leave edit mode, and I want to go ahead and apply my mirror modifier, because now we're going to go in and tweak. And so first, going back over to our object data buttons on the head UVs, or the body UVs, let's first, with the whole head selected, we're going to select everything, and we'll hit weld, just to get it out of there. Switch over to face mode, and we want to select the head, and the ears if I can. And then we are going to hit, or select everything in UV edit mode, hit W, weld, and P to pin it, move it out of there. And then we can just hide that, select the whole body, and hit U and unwrap. And now you'll notice that when we unwrap, since we applied the mirror modifier, we now have a very nice 2-sided mesh. At this point, we can go ahead and add a UV test grid because we need to see where the distortion is, where we need to fix issues, and things like that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click New, and you notice it immediately gives us a black image. So I can hit F6 to bring up my, I guess you could call it the operator panel. And we'll go ahead and make this a 2048 by 2048 map, and we want to enable the UV test grid. Okay, so now if we hit Alt-Z in the 3D view, we can see the UV test grid applied to our mesh. And right now, this actually looks pretty darn good. You'll notice that we're getting very little stretching. There's a little stretching around the breast, a little around the bottom, and a little bit on the feet and such. Although on the feet, there's really very little. There's just a little bit of distortion, but we're not seeing stretching. And another thing that we can do when we look for stretching is bring up the properties panel in the UV editor and enable stretch. and everything that is solid blue, which is the majority, is good to go. And then you start seeing a little bit of kind of teal on into green, yellow, and then red is the worst. My general rule of thumb is as long as there's no green, you're good to go. Which case there's not. We see a little teal in here on the breast, but there's not really a good way to fix that necessarily. We can maybe do a little manual tweaking by selecting areas in here and using the proportional edit by turning on O and hitting G to move these around. But really, chances are you're not going to be able to see much because Blender's UV Unwrapper is actually very, very good and does a very good job of unwrapping everything to minimize stretch as much as possible. And so since we're only seeing a little bit of stretch in here, I'm not going to worry about it. And in fact, in this area, we can almost, play into reality with us in that since this is an area that does see some stretching in skin occasionally, you can almost get away with it and make it work with you. Now, if it were right along the top of the breast or along the rib cage, then we would need to worry about it. But being where it's at, we can go ahead and just leave it as is. And this looks pretty good. So what I want to do now with the body is I want to try and merge some of these maps. Because right now, we have a lot of seams to try and texture out. There's a seam around the leg, the arm, shoulders, things like that. Now, the seams down the leg, down the arm, we can't avoid those. They're going to happen regardless. But we can go ahead and merge some of these. And so what I'm going to do is, let's go ahead and remove, we'll work on one side at a time and see what we can do. So I'm first going to remove the seam here along the shoulder, and I'm going to go around to the back, and let's go ahead and start here, and bring these seams down, or no, actually, let's do this. Starting here, let's bring these seams up like this. Nope. Okay, we're going to do this. We're going to take this edge, starting here, bring this down, which you'll notice this is kind of the seam between the muscles and the shoulder and the back. So that'll work well into the seams because it'll tend to be hidden. We'll bring these down, hit Control-E, and mark that seam. And let's go ahead and unwrap that and see what we get. Cool, so you can see that this is connecting pretty nicely. But we're getting some overlap here, and so we'll go ahead and remove this top shoulder seam and see if that works in for us. Sweet. So there we go. That worked real well. We just eliminated almost 2 full seams. We got rid of this whole area. Now there's just a little bit along the neckline there and the back of the arm where, again, you're not going to see it much. So we'll go ahead and do that same seam on the other arm. So bring this down. We hit Control-1 to go to back view. We can get a straight-on view so we can see more accurately what we're doing. We'll mark that seam, and then get rid of this seam here. And now unwrap that. And you can see both arms are connected very nicely. We're not getting hardly any stretching. There's just a teeniest bit here, teeniest bit there, a little bit there. Not anything to worry about. And you can see this, in effect, if we hit Alt-Z to bring in the UV test grid, you notice there's no seam here. So that makes it much, much easier to texture. Ideally, we would not have to have seams, but of course it just doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So let's do the same thing with the legs now. And I want to, since our focus is normally going to be on the front of the character, and since we have the crease along the buttocks to help us hide seams there, let's go ahead and try and remove this seam right along the front of the legs. So first, we'll just go ahead and remove that seam there up to this point and up to about halfway. And let's try unwrapping that. And you can see that's actually working pretty well, but we could probably go ahead and connect this even further. And in fact, maybe we can connect it all the way along. So let's go ahead and remove that. And we'll remove that. Whoops. I removed sharp rather than the seam. And we'll unwrap that. And there we go. That actually works real well. So that worked very well in our favor to just remove the entire seam from the leg, aside from going down. So in this case, we didn't need to separate them at all. There we go. And you can still see we're getting practically no stretching and no further stretching from what we were getting. So this is working very, very well in our favor. One last thing I would like to look at, and I can't guarantee this is going to work, but we may actually even be able to remove the hand seams and the feet seams. So let's go ahead and remove those seams. And we need to go ahead and bring these along. So we'll mark those seams because this seam needs to be connected so that it can unwrap well. And we can see that actually worked very well. So again, we'll do the same thing. We'll do the same thing on the other side and then add it to the feet. There we go. And so even though it was nice to be able to see where the seams were in the beginning so that we kind of filter things out, now we're able to go back and reconnect things such that they work well. And in this case, I'm actually going to redo some of what we did earlier. And I'm going to remove this seam here. Even though it works really well, it would be nice if this was a continuous loop, because this would be an easier seam or a harder seam to fix than one little seam here. And for one, this is along the bottom of the foot, where you're going to have a lot of calluses, you'll have discoloration in the skin, and so that's a better place to hide a seam than right along the normal skin tone. Okay, and you can see that clearly something has gone wrong. And so let's go ahead and look and see what we need to do. First off, I'm going to re-add the seam right around the ankle just to see what happens. So it's definitely something with that seam. And looking at this, this one may not be quite so easy to reattach. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this seam up again. We're going to mark that. And then let's try now removing that seam and unwrapping it again and see what we get. And there you can see it's starting to work better. We're getting some overlap here, so we've got some work to do. But what it's doing is allowing this straight form to come down and unwrap cleanly. So let's go ahead and let's think about this. The bottom will pretty much unwrap like this. We want the top coming straight down like you can see here. And so for this to unwrap, we need to think of it as if we were basically unfolding a piece of paper. So I'm going to bring this around and this up here, mark that seam, which then will remove this one. And so some of this, particularly when you're working with a complex form like this, can be trial and error. But once you get it, it can be very, very encouraging and well worth the work. So you can see where it's overlapping there. And I'm trying to think on how we could solve this. And it might be to just add in this seam here, such that the bottom of the foot is able to come down. First off, let's see what that does. Okay, there we go. That's starting to work better. But having done that, we could probably go ahead and, in fact, we are missing, there we go. Yeah, we're missing that chunk. And so let's go ahead and see about removing this seam. Now unwrap that. And again, causes serious problems, which I actually find rather interesting. So we're going to try something. And this is a technique that we really like how this is all working. And so let's just go ahead and select it all the way down to the ankles. And then we're going to pin it. As you remember, pinning it locks it in place. Although I'm going to leave the bottom loop unselected. So if we pin it, it's not able to unwrap any further. And so we'll do the same thing with those ones as well. And so now, if we select everything, hit U and unwrap, we can see how it'll be affected. And in this case, it's very, very small, and it's very clearly not working. So let's keep working with this. We're going to go back in and thinking. We're going to bring this seam back down, because anytime you can keep your seam straight, do. If you can make it follow the edge loops, it will generally work in your favor. I'm going to remove that one. Okay, see, we're getting close. It's just that we have the overlap here, which we might be able to fix, which using a tool called the Live Unwrap, which you can enable under the UV menu, it allows you by pinning parts of your mesh to modify it. And this actually is looking to work pretty well. So what it does is you pin a vertex, and that will keep the vertex from moving. So in this case, these will never move. But then if you grab that pinned vertex, it will interactively unwrap it around your pinning or around your mesh. And so we can see here that if we were to remove this seam entirely, because that actually fits real well in there, then our issue is just the bottom of the foot. And so let's swap this loop. We're going to first clear that seam around here. And let's try unwrapping around the other direction. We'll go around the other side of the foot. So we'll clear that seam, select it, and then deselect this area here and re-add that seam. Which unfortunately did not work in least. Well, we missed a couple edges there. There we go. There we go. Just like that. So now, since we unwrap the other way, we're able to avoid any of the overlap that it was wanting to affect. I'm going to unpin that one vertex there. Unpin, and then I'm going to turn off Live Transform or Live Unwrap. And we're going to unwrap that again just in case. There we go. Okay, so now let's go ahead and mirror these seams on the other foot. So we'll first mark this whole seam, and then we will deselect these areas here up to the big toe, clear that seam, and then we want to remove these seams. And so, although that may have been a little tedious, we made our way through it and ended up with a much better result and a much easier result to work with when texturing than we would if we were to just separate them completely. And so now, if we unwrap this completely, you'll see that we have two very nice feet. And I just unpinned that, and I'm going to go ahead and try unwrapping it again, just see what happens when it's unpinned. There we go. So it'll just help optimize that a little bit. So we have the entire body, minus the head, all unwrapped as a single UV island. And so at that point, I'm going to be sure to save my file before I lose something, which I should have saved a long time ago. And let's switch over to the head. Because at this point, this one, after we hit Control P to pack the island, or we just need to move it just a little bit, just so that it's not overlapping any of the margins, we can do this. Now, I will tell you there is one disadvantage to doing it this way, where we have a single map, and that is that you don't make nearly as good use of your entire image map as you would if you were to have the individual islands. Because essentially, all of this empty space is wasted pixels, and pixels that you're going to pay for in terms of the image size. And so you're not going to be able to get as much detail as you could if you were making use of all this space. And so if you have a lot of experience texturing, or if you're limited to low-res UV maps, it's a good idea to separate out the islands like we did originally, so that you can make as best use of this space as possible. But if you're not restricted to a small texture size or anything like that, then I encourage you to go this route, as you will find the texturing process to be much, much easier. Or the third route that you could do would be to use multiple UV maps, unwrap it once like this, once with all the islands packed very nicely. You could texture it on this one, and then bake out that texture to your other UV map, which would frankly probably be the best route because you would get the best of both worlds. But I'm not going to go any further into that, as that's for its own tutorial. But if that sounds of interest to you, then please leave a comment on the thread here on the post. And if there's enough of a response, then I will definitely look into that and see what we can do about bringing that into a tutorial or a tip of its own. But at this point, I want to go ahead and move on to the head. And just for one last check, let's go ahead and hit Alt-Z, and look at our very nice, fully unwrapped figure. So at this point, we're ready to do the head. So I'm going to switch back over to the head UV texture and hit Alt-H, hit Control-Tab and Face Mode, select the face, and then hit Shift-H to hide everything else. And remember, you can select it by hitting L. And at this point, we haven't unwrapped with the mirror modifier on, so let's first just hit U and unwrap. And we can see that. And I realized I also forgot the ears, so I'm going to hit Alt-H, and I want to select the ears, the head, and then I'll hit Shift-H to hide everything else, and I'll hit U and unwrap. Okay, so we're going to ignore the ears for the time being because we want to focus on the head, and so I'm going to bring in that UV test grid and hit Alt-Z, and let's look at this. So outside of edit mode, you can see that we've got some problems to resolve. Namely, the neck, which is wonderfully unwrapped. You're seeing no distortion, as you should, since it's a very circular form, a tubular form. But then we're seeing some stretching in here. These tiles are way bigger than these ones, so you're seeing a lot of distortion. And frankly, we want the most detail in the face. And so the way that I'm going to fix this is, you may get lucky and that your head just unwraps perfectly. But chances are, due to the neck areas, you're not going to. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the pinning feature to first unwrap just a portion of my face by going into edge mode. I'm going to set a loop right around the primary face area, so right in here. In fact, actually, I'm going to go in one more loop here by selecting those edges in edge mode, hit Control-E, mark that seam, and then I'll go ahead and go back to face mode, select that area, and hit U and unwrap. And what that does is that optimizes it for this area such that it's as good as it can be, basically. You'll notice there's a little distortion in the nose, but unfortunately, without adding some seams in there and then dealing with overlap, really not going to fix that. And that's okay. We really don't need to worry about that too much because, that part of the nose is going to tend to be stretched a little bit. It's tighter skin, and so we can probably leave it as is. It's not going to be our number one concern at this point anyway. Maybe we could fix it a little bit by going into face mode, select it, and maybe turn on proportional editing and scale it down a little bit. Or actually, we would scale it up and do just a little bit of tweaking, trying to work with both sides at the same time. You just want to be careful on how you tweak it so as to not cause even further stretching. And so, we can do just a little bit of tweaking, but again, be careful on what you do so as to not cause more problems than you're solving. As you can see, as I modify this, I'm getting a lot more stretching than I normally would. But as long as it's, still looking nice and clean on here, then we're pretty much good to go. Like I said, my general rule of thumb is that as long as there's no green, I don't worry about it. And that may be good, maybe bad, but I found it to work pretty well. And maybe we can fix some of that area. Since this is a crease right here, it's probably better that the distorted face be here, which is right here, rather than along this surface. And so at that point, I'm going to go ahead and leave that as is. Definitely refine it a little bit more. And now I want to select that area again. And we're going to select this entire island and hit P to pin it. So again, remember that is locking the entire thing in place such that it can't be modified. And so now, if I select the entire head, I'm going to first go back into edge mode, remove these seams such that it'll unwrap as one model again, and now hit U and unwrap. And I can select everything and hit Control P to pack the island since it was overlapping the ears, and we get a much, much cleaner result. And so even though the neck is still smaller, we can probably leave it as is, or if you're okay with the seams, which going back to the method that I mentioned a little bit ago, oops, not what I meant. There we go. Using the baking method to remove seams and packing to new islands, we can be a little bit more lenient with where we place seams. So for example, if I want to fix this neck just a little bit, if I add a loop right down the center and unwrap that, and we'll go ahead and select everything, hit Control P, and then I'm also going to select both ears just for the time being and hit P, just so it doesn't keep overlapping them. And now you can see that with that there, I've kind of scaled down the neck just a little bit and done that. But we do now have a seam going straight down the middle. And so for this purpose, I'm going to go ahead and remove that seam, as since the head has a full map to itself, I'm not too concerned about small differences in the size here, as I've still got, assuming that I'm working with a decently sized map, I've still got plenty to work with. If you're doing really fine sculpting, you may want to look into getting this a little cleaner, but for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and leave it as is. One thing I will give you a tip on, if you want to play with it, ways to help remove stretching or things like that are to put in darts, or it'd be single edges like this, or multiple edges, but small in-cuts. So I mark that seam there, and then I unwrap it, and although it's a bad case here, you can see that it's now added in that dart. And so since it's overlapped, that pretty much tells you that, oh, okay, I don't want to do it there. But that's essentially what we did around the forehead. Sometimes you'll see people do it along the bottom of the chin or jawline, things like that. But we're going to leave it as is. So I want to go ahead and work with the ears a little bit. So I'm going to select the ears and unpin them. So select everything and hit Control A. And that averages the island scales such that they fit their size relative to the size of the actual model, as you can see with the UV texture now. Now, the ears are one of those areas, since it's such a complex form, you're almost guaranteed to get some stretching in there. But we can get rid of some of it. And so what I'm going to do is I want to fold the ear over like I did on the hands and the feet. And so I'm going to bring it in right along here, getting rid of these vertices here. And I'm going to let it unfold the back edge. And so let's just bring that all the way around, mark that, and see what we get. I'm going to do this from face mode now, so I can select just it. We'll unwrap it. And you can see that that's now working much, much better. Although you immediately notice that since we have two complete separate islands, we now have two separate areas to unwrap. And this was not the intent, because I want this to just fold over. And so what I'll do is I can just remove a couple of these seams along the straighter portion of the ear, just clear that seam, and now from face mode, if I select it and hit U and unwrap, you'll see that I have one complete unwrap, and with not too much stretching. We're getting very little green. The green's just on the inside of the ear. Couple areas in here where it's pinching, we're starting to get just a tint of green, but again, those are areas that we don't really need to worry about. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that as is. And so let's select everything again and hit U and unwrap, select everything, and hit Control A to average the island scale, and then I can hit Control P to pack the islands such that it moves them in place. Oh, and I forgot to go ahead and add those seams on the other ear. So I'm going to just switch over to side view, and I can see my duplicate areas, so I'll just select those and select these. So basically I'm selecting over my seams such that it selects through to the other side. Mark that, unwrap it again, select everything, Control A and Control P, Control A and Control P in the UV window, and there we go. So that unwraps the entire head, at which point we can turn off the stretching so that we can see our area better. We can maybe turn on a different UV view, and there we have it. Maybe we'll select everything again, which seemingly A is not working, and we'll hit Alt-P. And I know that A does work. It has to do with the different modes that you're in, I do believe. There you go. In face mode, I'm able to select everything with A. In vertex mode, I am not. So just something to keep in mind, or at least to watch for if you run into trouble. And so at this point, I'm pretty much going to leave it as is, although I like to generally move the different areas around to fit them in place where they would go. So maybe I'll move this one over here a little bit, this one here. I like to keep them about the same rotation such that if I wanted, I could just duplicate their texture maps over. And we'll make this fit a little better. So I'm actually going to rotate it further around. There we go. Move it over. Do the same thing with this one. just to make it a little better use and a little better organization. And that's it. So at this point, we have a fully unwrapped character, which you can see if we hit Alt-Z, we've got the head here, the body there, and we're good to go. So this whole tutorial was on unwrapping a full stylized human body, but a full body, unwrapping the UVs and going from there. So at this point, you're pretty much ready to start texturing. And to export the UVs, you simply go to UVs, export UV face layout, save it out, open it up in Photoshop or your painting application of choice, GIMP if you're an open source guru, and have at it. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, again, never hesitate to submit a support ticket through our support page at Zendesk or by just adding a comment on the post. So again, I will see you next time, and thanks for watching.